The latest engine through the Phoenix Motors workshop is this 1984 YZ250 two-stroke motor. The guy who owns it called me to discuss a few issues. It's generally not running amazingly well, and it's running on when entering corners. My immediate response that it's most likely an air leak, the dreaded curse of the two-stroke engine. We discussed everything and he decided to bite the bullet and have the bottom end rebuilt with new bearings and seals. He was going to strip the engine out of the bike and take the top end off, which would save a bit of the cost of the work. When he brought the engine round, he discovered that the power valve seal had moved, snapping the retaining clip and splitting the outer O-ring seal, a definite cause of an air leak. When I set to and took the clutch cover off, I discovered metal shavings and steel ball bearings floating around the bottom end. I reckon he'd been pretty lucky, because this could have caused a lot of untold damage if it had run any longer. The bearing in the crankcase that the power valve governor runs in had completely collapsed. I removed all the bits of the collapsed bearing and made sure I counted all the bearings to make sure there were none missing. This could have been what caused the seal to come free in the top end, maybe. Good job we were replacing all of the bearings anyway. Now for the next problem, the transmission. Third and fourth pinion gears, the gears that run on the main shaft, had a bit of damage. And they were damaged on the dogs, and this could cause poor gear changes and other issues like jumping out of gear, and they definitely needed to be changed. So we started the search for replacement gears, but a mate came up trumps with a bottom end from the same year YZ250. Funnily enough, I sold him it. While I waited for that to turn up, I cleaned up the cases and installed all the new top quality bearings and seals ready. All of the bearings and seals were installed with a bit of assembly grease on the outer and inner races and on the sealing surfaces of the seals. A quick strip down of the other bottom end, and I double checked that the gears were the same before swapping them over. Doing this highlighted a mismatch. Fourth gear pinion on the good engine was one tooth smaller than the gear in the spare bottom end. A bit of investigation into the correct part, and it appears the correct gear is the one in the spare bottom end, and thankfully that gear was in perfect condition, as was third gear pinion too, so all good. Now, if you're using a different size gear on the main shaft, then you'll also need to change the corresponding gear on the counter shaft. So it looks like we'll need to swap fourth gear off the counter shaft too. When I took fourth gear off both shafts, I discovered they were both the same, which means that when they changed the gear on the main shaft for a smaller gear, they didn't change the corresponding gear on the output shaft. I think I just found the reason for the damage to the gears on the main shaft. So, transmission all rebuilt and bearings are in the cases. I'm wanting to check that the transmission works properly before applying the gasket sealant to the centre case. So, with the help of my assistant Scarlett, we have pressed the crank into the crankcase, as it helps to keep the cases lined up as they go back together. All gears are changing nicely, so let's go ahead and do the full build now. Scarlett used the crankcase separator tool here to pull the ignition side of the crankcase off. I went ahead and applied the gasket sealant to the centre cases, and now time to press the case halves back together again. When the two halves are pressed together and bolted up, I always check the action of the crank, as a tight crank would signify that it's not centred correctly. It was tight, so a visual inspection of the crank from the opening in the cases identified which side it was tightest to. A slight press from the closest side and a check after each press, and the crank soon span freely as it should. Now on to the rest of the build, and two things I want to mention. One is the clutch. I always check the clutch plates for wear, and to do this I check the service manual for the wear limit. On this bike it's 2.7mm for the fibre plates, so a lesson on using the micrometer for Scarlett, and we soon identified they were all within spec at just over 3mm, so we'll reuse them. Worn clutch plates would result in a slipping clutch. And careful when installing the pressure plate that we line the alignment marks up, as failing to do that will most likely mean that the clutch won't engage. Next thing is the power valve, and a quick lesson on what it does. Basically, it tunes the exhaust port for a better overall spread of power. For low end power, we want an exhaust port that is open for less time in relation to the piston's travel, so it's shorter in height. For top end power, we want an exhaust port that is open for longer, so it's taller in height. And to make mid-range power, we want it to be open and closed dynamically. What the power valve does is it reduces the height by blocking off part of the exhaust port at low revs. And at high revs, it's going to open up more of the exhaust port. The power valve on this motor is a barrel shape with a cutaway which rotates based on the speed of the engine, so it goes from restricting more of the exhaust port at low revs and it's closed, and as the revs build it gradually rotates, opening up more and more of the exhaust port until it becomes fully open at maximum revs and allowing the exhaust port as much open time as possible. There's a lot of maths involved in this, and it relates heavily to the actual exhaust itself as well, which I'll go into in more detail in another video. So there we go, a nice 1984 Yamaha YZ250 motor, fully rebuilt, a few problems identified and fixed. Now back to its owner to get ready for the 2025 race season. If you've got a motocross or enduro bike that needs engine work, whether it's vintage, Evo or modern bikes, 2 or 4 stroke, get in touch with me through www.phoenixmotos.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel.